with our first chapter called The Spirit of American Politics. So, what we're going to look at here is, what type of system do we have? Kind of an overview of American government, talking about some other ideas that have been used in government. What does our government do? Just kind of a chapter to get us started. Um, so when we look at the United States, most of you will know that we are a democracy. Most people, when they think of the United States, they think of democracy. Democracy is a form of government in which people hold power either by acting directly or through elected representatives. Well, here in the United States, we are what we would call a Republican democracy. That doesn't have anything to do with the political parties. What we mean by that is that we elect officials to go to the Capitol and make decisions on our behalf. And so that is what a republic is. There is a system of government called direct democracy. In a direct democracy, every single one of us would have to vote on every single thing, every bill, piece of legislation, anything like that. Every citizen would have to vote on it. In a country our size, we're rapidly approaching 350 million citizens. Having a direct democracy would just be unmanageable. And for the most part, if we look at trends of voting now, most Americans don't vote. It's still sadly a lot of Americans don't turn out to vote. So we elect representatives to go to Washington and at the state level to make decisions for us. We have the two houses of Congress, we have the president, we have judges. All of these, for the most part, are individuals that we elect, or we elect people to appoint other positions. So that makes us a Republican democracy. Going back to the beginnings of our country in the 1700s, the idea that our founding fathers came up with for their form of government was pretty revolutionary for its time. Now we'll talk about some of the areas where they had shortcomings and things like that. But when compared to most of the what we would call civilized world at that time, which would be mostly Europe, they had monarchies, and then even when you go to Asia, in China you had the dynasties that controlled China. In Japan, you had an emperor that controlled Japan. Things like that. So we were one of the earliest countries, who established ourselves without a king or a divine ruler. The idea behind this, a monarchy is that these individuals are selected by God. They rule through what's called divine right. That for some reason their family is selected by God to be the single ruler at the top of the food chain. We didn't want that. We fought an entire war with England to not have that. We instead took some ideas from philosophers like John Locke and then our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, these individuals. And we come up with this Republican form of democracy that really doesn't exist in most countries at the time of its creation. But we have to acknowledge that when our democracy was created, it was not created for everyone. Despite all of the language in the Constitution, which we'll talk about in that chapter, there were still a lot of people who did not have agency in our country. The poor, women, non-white individuals. These people were not recognized and given rights, initially when our country was founded. So, it's a bit ironic, and we're having conversations about this today, that, someone like Thomas Jefferson could, write all men are created equal while owning 600 slaves. So that is, from our beginnings, we create some really fantastic ideas that we don't necessarily live up to ourselves as a country. And so, that leads to other issues down the road that we'll get to this semester. Um, Today, we're at this point today where we're having a lot of civil unrest in our country. People still fighting for full recognition of their rights, for the right to stay in the country, to not be harassed and killed by police. So we still, as a country, we're a very young country, and we still have a ways to go, in this process. One of the biggest complaints about our system of government today is that the wealthy have too much control of our system. That the government essentially, if you are a corporation, if you are a group who is lobbying government, that those with the most money and resources can get what they want from government, and the average citizens like ourselves don't have that connection to get government to act in their best interest. Another complaint is that our government has become too big and has too much red tape, which we call bureaucracy. That there's so many people in government and so many processes that something has to go through to get done, that it actually slows the work of government down, and citizens don't truly get what they want. And there's a lot of talk about our government system right now, about whether we need to make changes to make it more efficient, to make it more equitable, things like that. And that's a lot of what you could write about, when you write your discussion post. But we'll talk more about these ideas as we go through the semester. Now, there's a couple of theories about the idea of government. So, pluralist theory. This is the idea that Alexander Hamilton believed in when we were founding our country. The idea that people can influence government best through groups, whether that is political parties, whether it's interest groups. We have nonprofits, we have citizen groups, things like that. And they rally behind a common cause and fight for that cause, but that there will be so many groups fighting for the attention of government that no one group could dominate that process. Now, that is very idealistic. That is what we would like to believe to be true. But unfortunately, at the founding of the country, our founding fathers couldn't imagine the system that we have now, and couldn't imagine the immense wealth of corporations like Amazon and Apple, and the power of interest groups like the NRA, or groups like that. That they have amassed a lot of power. And so, while it is true that we have a lot of groups competing for the attention of government, some of those groups have the power and the resources to far outspend the others. And so, many people believe our governmental system has become a pay to play system today. That those with the most money will get the best outcomes when it comes to government. And that goes into the next theory, which is what we call elite theory. There are some people who believe that those with the most power and the most money and the most influence should be the ones running the country, that they can make the decisions that are best for our country. I definitely don't agree with this theory, but it is a theory that exists. And so this is one of those ideas that people get very jaded about government over. It's like, oh, what does it matter? Why should I vote if these wealthy, powerful people just control government anyway? And a lot of arguments could be made that we're seeing that right now, especially in the executive branch, with President Trump being President Trump. And then maybe, after President Trump is out of office, this will inspire us to make some changes, make some reforms, make our system more equitable to the average American citizen. But there are people that believe that the wealthy and the powerful should be the ones in charge. Most of us probably don't believe that. Bureaucratic theory, we talked about the red tape of government, the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, essentially, at its core, are just the day-to-day workers of government. Not the people who are elected, but the people who are hired and work in all the government agencies and actually do the work. And that they really have control of government because they're the ones who, you know, put policy into action. So Congress can pass a bill, but it takes a government agency, fully staffed with workers to make that bill real, to enforce rules and regulations and things like that. Now, there is a bit of a split here depending on your political leanings. People who tend to be very conservative do not like government bureaucracy. They believe that because these individuals are not elected by the people, that they shouldn't have a lot of control on how government works. Unfortunately, the people that we elect to office do not also have the time to put things into practice. And so, if we want government to function, we have to hire people to do that day to day work. Um, and then, social movement theory is really what we're seeing right now. Social movement theory that the true power lies with the people. This is what it says in the Constitution, that the power is derived from the consent of people, that government has power because people give it power, and that if we don't like the actions of our government, the best way to show that is to rise up and protest, create change, vote people out of office, create social movements around things that we don't like. So, good examples of this historically, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, any identity movement, the struggle for civil rights for every group that we can think of. And then, of course, right now, a lot of the conversation is around Black Lives Matter, which is kind of the modern embodiment of the continuation of the civil rights struggle. So, people forget sometimes that they are the ultimate power in this system. And the best way to be heard is to find lots of people who feel the same way you do and show that by taking to the streets. And that's what we've seen, this summer and, starting around like May and April, when these movements really started to organize, we're seeing people showing their dissatisfaction with government. So this is social movement theory in action. All right. Now, a lot of you would say, if I asked you, do you like government? And people would say, no, I don't like politics. Politics and government are two very different things. Government is just the institution of how we, the structure we place our faith in, place power in to run the country. Politics is more like a game. It's who gets what, when, and how. Politics is the game that our elected officials play. It's how we make collective decisions, but there's bargaining, there is deal making, there is. Sorry about that, y'all. Forgot to put my do not disturb on. So it's the game that our politicians play to decide who gets what, when, and how through all the processes of legislation and trading votes, and there's lobbying and all that kind of stuff. So that's politics, and that's typically what people don't like. But government is different. It's the structure itself. And government should be ideal. Politics is not always ideal. Um, but talking about the ideas that define our politics, if we look at ourselves historically, liberty is one of those things that is mentioned a lot in American government, American history, and we'll talk more about this in the next chapter. But it's a word that gets tossed around a lot, and people don't really stop to think about what it means. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next chapter. Democracy, which is the power of the people. We all vote. We all can express how we feel. In a democratic nation, the true power lies with the people. And sometimes we get a bit pessimistic and jaded about that and think that we don't have the power. But I think what's happening in our country right now really is showing, that we do have that power. When you get enough people behind an idea, the people in power have to stop and listen. So we'll talk about that more as we go through the semester, especially in our civil rights chapter, because that's where we really see democracy in action a lot. Now, at odds with that is the idea of individualism. This is a problem we are really seeing in practice right now. Individualism, we as a country have a very unique history, compared to other nations. We started all on the East Coast as a country. The everyone comes over, settles along the East Coast and down into Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama. Um, but we have this massive landmass that we believe should be ours. We call it manifest destiny, that eventually the United States will stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That was the dream of the founders and many that came after them. But this part of our history where we're pushing westward, and the frontiersmen in the 1800s who move westward, take land away from Native American tribes, it builds this idea of individualism, that if you want to make something of yourself in this country, you've got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you got to work for it, you got to fight for it. And it kind of fostered in us this sense of what we want mattering more than what the collective wants. We don't tend to think of ourselves as a collective country the way other countries do. If you go to Europe, if you go to Canada, if you go to Asia, there are a lot of countries where they think of themselves as a collective. But many people think that the United States may be too big, too diverse, too varied in our regions and things like that to have this sense of cohesiveness. And so we tend to have this more of a sense of individualism. And you can see it right now really playing out in the real world. People being asked to wear masks because we're fighting a pandemic, and we have to think of others first. Well, what have we seen in light of this is people who are fighting wearing a mask, fighting, adhering to the advice of, infectious disease experts like Dr. Fauci and things like that. And that's that individualism, that how dare you, the government, tell me what to do. And there's a lot of that in our country that we don't see. If we were to say, if you look at Asia, if you look at China and Japan and many of those countries, they were wearing masks before this started. And, when as a collective there, they do it or they're kind of shunned from that society. But we don't have that same kind of mentality here in the United States. It's more me, not us, us, us. And of course, that's a generalization, but it is something that we're seeing play out for real right now. Limited government. Limited government is at the core of our disagreements on government. The two sides, the left and the right, have different ideas about this. If you tend to be a conservative individual, you don't like government having too much power. You want government to just provide the things that are kind of the necessities, the bare minimum, and kind of stay out of your life when it comes to the rest of it. People who prefer limited government aren't fans of taxes. They're not fans of government overreach, especially, something like the governor issuing an order that we all have to wear masks. Most of the people who are very opposed to this tend to be conservative individuals. If you're a more liberally minded individual, you tend to look at government as the entity that has to enforce the rules, that has to create an equal society for us, and that government should use its power to do those things. And so this is where a lot of our disagreement, a lot of our polarization comes in, is just on the idea of how much authority should government have. And that has existed since the founding of our country. And we'll talk about that in the Constitution chapter. The American dream and religious freedom, I'll save those for the next chapter because we're going to go through each of these ideas in more depth. Now, checks and balances. This is written into the Constitution, and most of you, if you went to school in the United States, are probably familiar with the term and kind of what it does. There are three branches of American government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And our founding fathers created a system where no one of those branches was supposed to be more powerful than the other, that they all kind of check and balance each other's power. So the president, is the head of the executive branch, appoints individuals to cabinet positions to head up agencies, appoints high level judges, and has limited power to enact his agenda through like executive orders and things like that. But all of those things can be challenged in the other branches of government. If the president wants to appoint someone to the Supreme Court, that individual has to make it through a confirmation process in the Senate, which is part of the legislature. If the president wants to issue an executive order, it has to be constitutional, or the Supreme Court, the head of the judicial branch, can declare it unconstitutional and cancel it. So each branch in different ways are accountable to the other two. There are protections to prevent one of them from becoming too overpowered and too tyrannical and controlling our system. So institutions we won't talk about right now because we have whole chapters about different institutions. So we'll talk about those later. Now, rational choice theory is something that, political scientists, this theory was asserted. It's the idea that political behavior assumes that individuals are rational and will act on their political interest. And so that's a question maybe you want to address in your discussion post. Do you believe this? Do you believe that all individuals, when they vote, when they elect people to office, are acting rationally and acting on what is best for themselves? Some people believe yes, but there is a lot of argument to the contrary. So that's just kind of a question I'll leave up to you to answer, and that would be a good discussion post. The idea behind government is that government should pursue the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but it cannot do so at the expense of people in the minority. And we don't mean minority as in, say, a racial minority, but just people who are in the minority of a particular point of view. So let's say that, the majority of people in our country, if we go back a decade, the majority of people in our country did not agree with the idea of gay marriage. But when that question came before the Supreme Court in 2015, Supreme Court ruled that you could not deny gay couples the same rights and privileges that are granted to married straight couples. And so just because most of the country is in favor of something, it still has to be in agreement with the Constitution. The Constitution is supposed to be our end-all, be-all decider of those types of questions. And so if we have a document that says you have these rights and you have these privileges, but yet we're not giving those rights and privileges to all citizens for one reason or another, then there's a case to be made that what the majority of Americans want isn't constitutional, and we have to protect the rights of minorities. And that can be a minority in any way. But government is driven by individuals. If you want government to do something, people have to act. And of course, the easiest way to act is to vote. But many people will go beyond that. They will protest. They will organize movements. They will start nonprofit organizations committed to a certain ideal. Government is not a passive thing. It is an active thing. If you want government to live up to your ideal, you have to participate in it. So that's something that we as a country are getting better at, but for a while there was a lot of apathy about government. So what does government do? Government is a set of institutions that makes decisions for us. But again, people have a responsibility to be involved. So you can sit back and just let government do what it wants to do. But, if you're going to complain about it, then you probably should get up and get off your ass and go do something. So it's not a passive thing. We have to tell government what we want, otherwise, things are just going to be forced upon us. Government provides a lot for citizens. Government builds our roads, our schools, protects us from foreign aggressors, establishes rights and privileges, all this kind of stuff. But we have to be a partner in that process. And so, government can provide something, but then they also use private individuals, private institutions to make sure that all of those goods, services, whatever, are being distributed fairly, equally in the way they should be. But if you look at this chart over here, this chart on the right, this is about citizen satisfaction with government. And it kind of shows you that we kind of peaked right at the beginning of LBJ's term in office. And then we see that trust in government declines drastically under the next three presidents. And then we have a pattern of it kind of going up and down, and then it peaks again under George W. Bush at 9/11, and then kind of tapers down again, and we're at one of the lowest points we've ever been in history right now. So if you think about what happened during LBJ and Nixon, this was the Vietnam War, and this was when the American people find out that government had been lying to them about a lot of things. And so this really shakes American trust in government institutions, and it's something that we don't ever recover from. And if you look at government today and you look at how people respond to government, we have a situation now where people won't even believe something about government unless it comes from someone who they trust or agrees with their political point of view. We have President Trump, he loves to say fake news and things like that. And so if you're trying to have a discussion with someone over something political, and let's say that you got your information from, I don't know, NPR. Well, if that person doesn't like NPR or thinks NPR is too liberal or too conservative, then they're likely to say, oh, I don't believe that. Even though what you're saying may be documented with facts. And so this is what distrust in government has done to us as a country, is that it has pushed us apart in many ways. We don't come together and work on compromised agreements as much as we used to. And so our trust continues to decline. Citizens, are very polarized over this. They trust institutions that agree with their point of view. We see this on social media. And so, but a lot of the general public is very unaware of what government truly does on a day to day basis. Today, we may not have a lot of good examples just because, President Trump has definitely disrupted the way this system tended to work before him. So, but we'll talk about this as we go throughout the semester and what government gets right and what government gets wrong. So, basic functions of the U.S. Constitution. So, the Constitution, like I said, is our guiding document. We have a whole chapter on it here in a bit. But what it does, kind of a summary of what it does. It establishes justice. It creates a justice system. It creates rights that we are entitled to simply for being American citizens. Ensure domestic tranquility. Try to keep things as level and calm as possible at home. We have a military to protect us from outside invasion. We have institutions like law enforcement within the country that are supposed to maintain civil order. Provide for the common defense, same thing. Promote general welfare. This is probably the one idea that people are very divided on. What does the general welfare mean? Some people say, that this includes, government being responsible for some basic necessities like food, water, healthcare is one that we can't agree on. Should government have a bigger role in making sure all Americans have access to healthcare? So this one is probably the most controversial as to what government's role is when it comes to the idea of welfare. And that's not welfare in how we think of it, like government services, food stamps, things like that, but just, these certain things that are, they're necessities for life. What is government's role when dealing with those things? Securing the blessings of liberty. Well, that's really kind of open, isn't it? It kind of depends on what liberty means to you. And again, I talked about how that's kind of that word gets thrown around a lot, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter about what does liberty really mean. Do you think government fulfills these obligations? This is a good prompt here for a discussion post. Do you think our government does a good job, providing for these five things? And then, what do they mean to you? What does general welfare mean to you? What does the blessings of liberty mean to you? So this is another good thing where you could write a post over right here as well. Now, who are we? This is one of those issues that we are still dealing with as a country. We are probably one of the most diverse nations in the world and have been for a long time. And so, along with that, comes problems that other countries either don't deal with or are just starting to deal with on the scale that we have been dealing with for a long time. But at its core, the United States is a nation of immigrants, but we often don't speak openly and truthfully about this and our history. Unless you are a Native American, you are an immigrant. Your family came here from somewhere else. Um, so this starts a lot of problems for our country that this land was taken from people who already occupied it when Europeans got here. So Native Americans had occupied North America for 10,000 years before the first Europeans arrived, starting in the 1400s. Many of the earliest arrivals are the Puritans, the Pilgrims. This is the story we know, that they land on Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts in 1620, declare and establish a city on the hill, bring with them their Christian beliefs, and immediately declare Native Americans savages, the enemy, and establish this idea, with these individuals. This is where this idea comes from that, manifest destiny, that God wills it, that we will control the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The idea of the city on the hill is this ideal Christian nation, that will exist. And all of this comes from these individuals settling here. Um, so this is the dominant culture. This is the story that we're told growing up, the pilgrims, Thanksgiving, all that kind of stuff. But unfortunately, a lot gets left out in these narratives about the true history of the United States. And so we're going to talk about that stuff. And it's not the most comfortable stuff to talk about, but we are going to talk about it. African Americans, obviously, most African Americans come to the United States. They are brought here as slaves. The slave trade comes to North America in 1619. You could argue that Columbus, brought it earlier than that, but we're talking about what would become the United States. The slave trade really starts in 1619. And many African Americans are brought here as slaves. Ties to their homelands, their culture is erased, and so through the decades of slavery, African Americans essentially become this group of people separated from their homeland and their original culture, and now is kind of a separate entity and a separate culture within our country. To be African American is not to be from Africa. It is a thing that wholly exists, that African American culture grows out of its place in the United States, and so that is heavily affected by the history of slavery, living in the white dominant culture and things like that. And we'll talk more about this in civil rights and how African Americans have been their rights have been neglected. They have been held back by some of our systems that we have put in place. We're going to talk about that. Latinos. I myself am Latino, so this is where a lot of my research is focused on, and so this one obviously is very close to my heart. But Latinos have been in the United States longer than the white settlers that come in the 1600s. Latinos at our core, we are a mixture of the Spanish that come and settle Central and South and North America, and the indigenous people who were already here. But Latino, people, there's different words that different people prefer: Latino, Hispanic, Chicano, whatever it is. If you're Puerto Rican, Boricua, things like that. But Latinos are present in the United States as early as the 1500s. The Spanish start having contact with indigenous people in the what is now the southern United States, as early as the 14 and 1500s. And so many people of Latino descent, we're still looked at as outsiders in this country, but yet have been here for the entire history of this country. Yeah, but yet still are dealing with many of the same issues as the African American community in a struggle for civil rights and recognition and equity and things like that. Asian groups are ones that are not talked about near as much, but in our civil rights chapter, we will go into the Asian struggle for civil rights. But, Asians have been present in the United States since the early 1800s. Many came to the United States, for the same opportunities, but end up being excluded from certain parts of society, discriminated against, and are used as cheap labor, treated very poorly. And of course, Japanese Americans, Asians are the only group of people to have ever been interred in prison camps by the United States government. So we'll talk about a lot of these things. But one thing that I will talk about a lot this semester, we talk about these racial issues and how some people don't like to talk about race. It's an uncomfortable conversation. Some people are very energized about this movement that's happening in our country right now, and there's uncomfortable conversations that are going to happen when it comes to race and equality and equity in our country. But a lot of conflict in our country right now that we're seeing is generational as well. We have four generations that are now adults in this country. We have the baby boomers, which are the children of, the people that fought in World War II. They have controlled our politics for a very long time. They're very old and they don't want to relinquish any power to the rest of us. They had the ideal American life. They got to go to college for cheap. They bought their first houses when they were in their early 20s. Their parents worked hard, so they didn't have to. So they got a lot handed to them, and a lot of privileges and things that we don't enjoy today. Of course, their children are the Gen Xers, the kind of apathetic generation. We don't hear from them near as much. And then, of course, our two younger generations are the millennials and the Gen Zers, which most of you will belong probably to Gen Z at this point. These are groups that I'm a millennial, I'm an older millennial, but, we don't have the same opportunities that baby boomers had at our age. And we're very upset about that. And so a lot of these movements that we're seeing about whether it is racial equity, financial equity, the conversation about student loans, how we're all saddled with student loans coming out of college. We're trying to start our life, but we can't because we have all this debt. The baby boomers didn't deal with that. College costs, you could pay for, your college education by working a summer job for baby boomers, So there's a lot of inequality between the generations that is also causing a lot of conflict in our country today. And we'll talk about that as it relates to different things as we progress through the semester. Now, who are we as a country? The idea of who is American. For a lot of our history, there's been kind of this gatekeeper mentality about who is American. Well, truly in our country, everybody's American, regardless of your race, ethnicity, country of origin. Once you come to this country and become a citizen, you're American. But of course, white citizens still are the majority in our country. This graph kind of shows you how those numbers are changing. So, right here at 2020, we are probably around 50 something percent white. But Latinos are the fastest growing population. And so in some states like Texas, Latinos will actually become the equal to the white population very soon and then outnumber the white population thereafter. So, what it means to be America or what it means to look American is changing. So, we see that all demographics are growing going forward, except for white citizens. And so this could be, one of those things that is the reason why we're seeing a lot of this conflict right now is just that our country is changing a lot. And, people do not like change. It makes them uncomfortable. And so this, as much as these conversations are uncomfortable to have, they're conversations we have to have, and we will talk about this type of stuff as it relates to what we're talking to going through the semester. But this chapter is just kind of an overview of what we're going to be talking about, and there's a lot of ideas here that you can write about throughout the semester. So that's our first chapter, and the next chapter will kind of go into those ideas that we were talking about in more detail.